Fellow Missourians, how would you like for your vote to count? You may say, well, it already does count. But think about it for a minute. When it comes to the presidential elections, we know what's going to happen here in Missouri. The Republican's going to win. Whether we vote for candidate A, candidate B, whether we vote or don't vote, it's probably not going to matter. This isn't just the feeling some Missourians feel. This is the case for people across the country, where they feel like their vote doesn't really make a difference. In the last speech I gave for this course, I was talking about the Electoral College and that we should maintain it rather than moving to a popular vote. Now, there's a slight tweak we could make to the Electoral College to make it just a little bit better and to iron out some of these problems that we have with it. So today I want to explain why we should get rid of the winner-take-all portion of the Electoral College and instead use a proportional method. To do this, we're going to look at the status quo, so what we're dealing with now, what the solution looks like, and what the benefits are of the proportional method. So first of all, the winner-take-all system is not in the voters' best interest. Here's how winner-take-all works. There's 48 states that use winner-take-all, so when voters in that state vote for the presidential candidate, the voter with the candidate that gets the most votes gets all of the electoral votes in that state. Maine and Nebraska are the exception to this rule. They distribute their electors proportionally. They have a proportional method. Now, winner-take-all is not something that is required by the Constitution. This isn't something that states have to do, but it's something they have decided to do because by doing winner-take-all, they get more electoral clout. They get more weight in the election. The candidate sees, oh, I can get many more electors by winning this state, and those are the states they go for. So states want to do this, and they haven't turned back from it since they started doing that. But this has caused voters in America to suffer in a sense. Candidates are only concerned about certain states now in the campaign for the presidency. They care about the battleground states. In fact, 99% of campaign spending in 2016 was spent on just 14 states. 99% of spending went to just 14 states. And what happens is voters just end up not really caring. If you're a Democrat in Kansas or if you're a Republican in New York, you're probably not as likely to turn out. You're not as motivated to be involved because you know the Democrat's going to win in New York and the Republican is going to take all the electoral votes in Kansas. You know that that is what is going to happen. And so what happens is that sometimes we don't get the president that America wants. This happened with President Bush and with President Trump as well, where they win the Electoral College but don't win the popular vote. Now, this isn't a problem because candidates know how the system is supposed to work. They know it's the Electoral College. Voters know it's the Electoral College. But if we get rid of winner-take-all, we can make this a little less controversial, and such a situation would probably become less common. And I'll explain how that works here in a moment. But further, when you have marginalized voters like Republicans in New York or Democrats in Kansas who stay home or decide not to vote or just vote for some other random person, we end up not getting the voting results, the president that Americans want. And this is something that we should fix. Voters are being ignored because of winner-take-all, and the results aren't necessarily what Americans are after. So here's the solution, the proportional distribution method that's called proportional allocation. And this is a little tricky to explain, but I'll do my best and then we'll see how this plays itself out. Each state has a certain number of electors that are dependent on the representation you have in Congress. Every state has 2 electors for the senators that they have in Washington, D.C., and then a number of electors based on the members they have in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. Here in Missouri, we have 10 electoral votes because we have 10 representatives in Washington, D.C., 8 representatives, 2 senators. This is how it works for all states. The proportional allocation would set those 2 electors for each state that represent their senators, set those aside for a minute, and they would distribute the remaining electors in proportion to what the candidates win in that state. Let's play out an example to see how this works. We'll use the state of Washington as an example because Washington has 12 electoral votes. So we can set 2 aside, so we just have 10 and work with those 10. Let's say we have 3 candidates running for president in the state of Washington. one candidate receives 50% of the votes. So he gets 50% of the electors. He would get 5 electors. If candidate B receives 30% of the vote, he would get 30% of the electors, or 3 electors. And the last candidate, candidate C, if he received the remaining 20% of the votes, he would get 20% of the electors, or 2 electors. So candidate A would receive 5, candidate B would receive 3 electoral votes, candidate C would receive 2 electoral votes. Now, those 2 votes that we set aside, those go to the person with the most votes. That would be candidate A. So instead of candidate A getting all 12 of Washington's electoral votes with the current system, each candidate that ran and got votes would be represented by a certain amount of electors. This seems like a fair method. Okay, so how does this empower voters? And you're probably seeing how this starts to make sense. Well, first of all, campaigning would be much more widespread. No longer would candidates just be going to the battleground states, the states where you don't know if it's going to go red or blue. They would be going across America, knowing that they can get a proportion of any state's vote, that a Republican can go to California and gain some votes, and that a Democrat could go to Texas and gain some electoral votes. Voters across America would not be ignored, and voters would become more motivated, and they would begin to have a much a better voice no matter what state they were in, and there'd be increased voter turnout. Voter turnout has been low in the United States, and especially in states that are locked up, that are specifically red or specifically blue, but this would give voters a voice. So just visualize what this would look like. Better campaigns. We'd see better campaigns where money is distributed better, where candidates are visiting Americans and wanting to appeal to all their needs. You may even see some third-party candidates have a better chance because they can get a proportion of the electoral votes. And secondly, America would be a much more involved democracy. Americans would be more involved. They'd be going to the polls on election day knowing that their vote would count. But if we don't do this, what happens? The same old campaigns, the same old states that are the battleground states that are of concern, and the same old states and the same old voters that get ignored. We don't need that in America. Let's see that start to change. Winner take all was made so that states could maximize their power, but that has come at the cost of voter turnout, come at the cost of voter involvement, come at the cost of campaigning and questioned results. Our current system isn't broken. In fact, it works a lot of the time, but we can make it better. Every state needs to move from winner take all to proportional allocation. And the result of that would be, as the Harvard Political Review said, quote, "At long last, the votes of all Americans would matter."
Applause.